The fire of the soul burns red in this amazingly action-packed episode of Dororo. Greetings, my friends. Are you ready to get into some demon-slaying action? Because that's exactly what you're going to get in the second episode of Dororo, a series which is continuing to surprise me with its overall quality, its solid action, and its really awesome and timeless story, if a little crazy when you actually think about it. It's actually a really intriguing story, as he's going to have to go around, solve problems, right wrongs, fight monsters, and get his body parts back. That's actually why he got his face back in the very first episode of the series. And while he did get his face and his eyes, he still can't see. It looks like there's still some things that he's going to have to obtain, such as his very senses as well, not just the physical body parts. And I think that's pretty fucking cool when you actually think about it. Good thing it looks like the doll-like swordsman known as Hyakkimaru is not going to be in this alone, as he is going to be joined by the very young and inquisitive Dororo. He is the namesake of the series after all, so I expect great things from his character and hopefully a lot of development. Even though he is a kid character, he's actually not that annoying, and I don't really find him all that abrasive. A lot of the times they can introduce these sidekicky young characters which can really get fucking annoying, but Dororo is actually really awesome and is in many ways sort of like the main narrator of the series, seeing as how Hyakkimaru doesn't have the ability to speak or even communicate with anyone. Dororo is really our only means of actually communicating with a character on a normal human level. Of course, that's only a matter of time before Hyakkimaru actually regains most of his humanity, although a part of me still wants me to see him keep those really badass sword arms. They also do a pretty good job of giving us a little subtle backstory on Dororo. We know that he's an orphan, but we don't really know the circumstances behind it, and we get to see that he has these nightmares about his mother crying out for her, and he suddenly wakes up. This is a pretty common thing for him, and I'm really interested to see what his backstory is going to be and how it's going to tie into all of this, if it's actually connected at all, or if it's just its very own storyline. But honestly, I'm in it to win it. I'm very excited to see what the rest of the series is actually going to bring. But this episode right here was honestly a pretty simple episode, as it was another one with Dororo and Hyakkimaru arriving in some sort of village that needs a problem solved. And of course, that problem is going to be a demon which needs its ass slayed. So the main story of this episode involves Hyakkimaru and Dororo arriving to this village which is desperately looking for help as they're being attacked by this very evil creature, and they're being asked specifically by this leader who goes by the name of Bandai, this very wise woman. And when Hyakkimaru actually meets her for the very first time, he tries to just slice her damn head off. He senses that there's something completely wrong with her, and that's when we start to learn a little bit more of how he actually sees the world. They actually bring in that old mysterious swordsman who has the guitar from the previous episodes, and we get to see that he's also fallen prey to this village as well. He arrived, he tried to attack the leader, and of course, he was promptly thrown in jail. But this is convenient because now that all of these characters are in the same place together, we get to learn a little bit more about how these two seemingly blind characters actually view people in the world. They are quite literally able to see the fire of their soul. Basically, they can actually just see the physical soul of someone, which according to the old man mostly takes the form of flames. Someone who's just a normal good human like Dororo actually just kind of looks like a white flame, but something that's big and evil of course looks all demonic and red. This is actually what Hyakkimaru saw when he was looking at this wise woman Bandai. Eventually, Hyakkimaru decides to go after Bandai once again, which ends up revealing her true form. We actually get to see that her body was actually just the tail of this very disturbing looking fucking creature, which kind of reminds me of the true form of Envy from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. The battle, predictably, of course, is pretty freaking epic and really fun to watch, and of course, Hyakkimaru is able to finish off his opponents in the blaze of glory, but the big shocking twist of this episode is we get to learn that everyone who actually lived within that village that was being ruled by that creature were completely complacent with what they were doing. You see, they were actually trapping people in this village and feeding them to the evil demon. In this way, they were able to sort of pickpocket all of their money, and this is how they were able to be prosperous. Basically, they were driven by greed. And a giant fucking green monster. Maybe that's intentional. Green, of course, is the color of cash. The episode ends with Hyakkimaru suddenly freaking out as his nervous system starts to flare up. I'm guessing he is regaining something in his body, some sort of sense. Maybe it's his vision, maybe he can hear, maybe he can talk. I'm really interested to see. I'm just waiting for that episode. So the episode ends, and what I also really love about this series is how if you watch to the very end of the credits, they always do this like old school Japanese oil painting of the monster that they actually fought in the episode, and it just looks really cool. It's a nice touch and a great period to an overall fantastic episode. So what's the rundown on this episode of Dororo? It's really easy to see why this is probably going to go down as something of a cult classic anime series. I can already tell that people are really enjoying this story, especially because it's actually sort of reinvigorated their interest in Osamu Tezuka's previous stories. I've seen a lot of people doing comparison videos of Dororo to the original version, and it's drastic to see how much has actually changed in this short amount of time. And yet the story still manages to feel really fresh. That's what I really love about it. Of course, me going into this series blind and not really knowing much about anything about Dororo does help, but man, this is just a show that's really easy to like, and when you watch it, you know exactly why. Also, man, I talked about it a little bit in the first episode, and I know a lot of people have been talking about it too, but is the intro of this series just not damn perfect? Like, every single frame. Every single lyric is perfectly timed with every single piece of imagery, and it's one of those intros that I find myself just kind of constantly re-watching over and over and over. Hell, before I watched this episode, I think I watched the intro 3 times, just for the sake of actually enjoying it. It's an intro that just sort of gets into your blood and you absolutely love it, and it's one of the cooler anime intros that I've seen in a while, and it's one of many this season, so I really think that is actually saying a lot. In many ways, I look forward to watching Dororo just so I can rewatch that intro again, but luckily the actual story itself does manage to be pretty enduring and awesome, especially the overall relationship between Dororo and Hyakkimaru. It's very interesting, and I can't wait to see how it's going to develop as the actual series is going to go on. This is some more solid Dororo stuff. You guys need to check it out. I'm giving this episode a 5 out of 5. If I had any complaints about the episode, they'd mostly be superficial and nitpicky. Well, as it turns out, I didn't really have much of an opportunity to edit this video before the new episode came out, so guess what? You're getting 2 reviews for the price of 1, and the price is free, so that's pretty damn good. We're going to be talking about this next episode of Dororo, which immediately goes into Hyakkimaru's backstory. And it's a pretty intriguing backstory, as it actually does connect with that one random mysterious prosthetic doctor who's going around all of these various battlefields and honoring the dead by replacing their limbs with prosthetics. We get to learn in this episode that this is actually the person who eventually found Hyakkimaru, saved him, rehabilitated him, and taught him the way of the sword. Most of this episode is actually dedicated to this character who goes by the name of Dr. Jukai. And Dr. Jukai is a very interesting character. He's not exactly good, and he's not exactly bad either. He has a very dark and cloudy and shrouded past, which is absolutely covered in all sorts of blood. In fact, the introduction to him in this episode is watching him as he quite literally crucifies soldiers, torturing them, cutting off body parts for some unknown reason. And apparently he spent the rest of his life sort of trying to atone for his sins by being a regular doctor and helping out people who actually need prosthetics. But really, it seems like this is a character who's never going to be fully redeemed, or at least that's the way that he views it himself. He realizes that he's done absolutely terrible things, and there's even a part of the story where one of his young apprentices actually realizes that his family was killed by this very man, and even though he was raised by him, and he was actually saved and even had one of his legs replaced with a prosthetic, he could not get rid of his hatred and decided to leave the doctor to wallow in all of his misery. This is when we learned that he eventually did find the boat that Hyakkimaru was in, and I have to say, seeing the image of him as a baby again is absolutely terrifying, considering he has no skin, eyes, nose, and can barely communicate at all. But Dr. Jukai sees this as an opportunity to sort of make something bad into something good, and he decides to raise this child, and over the course of time, we get to see him grow into the Hyakkimaru that we know now, with his brand new prosthetic limbs, and of course being able to eventually fight against demons, being able to see the fire that is within their soul. One element of the story that I think is very similar to the Berserk manga series, and in many ways you you could say that the Berserk manga series actually took that from this, is that because Hyakkimaru is a child which was sort of like affected by the power of demons, it actually sort of like draws in all of these other creatures which are constantly trying to attack him. And throughout his childhood, there's multiple moments where all of these monsters are trying to kill him, but he always manages to one-up them and destroy them. And over time, this is when we start to learn that he can actually sort of regain his limbs, his body parts, and even his very senses. There's even a really creepy scene where his leg, which is completely missing, all of a sudden just starts to grow back out of nowhere. However, it's shown that this is going to be a very slow process, kind of like what's already been revealed in the series, where even though his leg does grow back, it doesn't have any skin over it. It's just meat and bone. But just the fact that he's finally starting to get these limbs back is really important. It also helps that he can't really feel any sense of pain, so he's able to sort of work through all of this. And as time goes on, he starts to regain more of actually who he is, and it starts to make him much more of a human character. And that brings us forward into the story, where we get to see what's going on in the current timeline. At the end of the last episode, after defeating Bandai the Demon, suddenly his nervous system was being like just attacked with all of these brand new feelings he's never felt before. The feeling of sensation, of pain, something he's never felt before, and even though he can't fully communicate any of this, he actually demonstrates it by sticking his foot in a burning fire, which completely shocks him, but again, he has no real way to express this feeling he's never felt before. So what's the rundown on this episode of Dororo? Another fantastic episode showing us the true origins of Hyakkimaru, and I'm really glad that they didn't have to spend a couple of episodes actually explaining it, because it's deceptively simple, and a lot of this stuff is actually told simply through the imagery, especially because Hyakkimaru himself is a character who can't really communicate with people, although I'm still kind of confused as to how all of these prosthetics work. There's a scene earlier on in the episode where he's clearly wearing a mask, but he's still able to move his mouth in some way. I'm not really sure how this worked. Maybe only like the lower half is gone. I don't know. It's very strange. I'm not sure how this prosthetic stuff even works. Really, you shouldn't even have to question it at all. The episode also did a very good job of just demonstrating through the animation and through some small moments that this is a very dangerous world. There's a scene where there's this young kid who apparently loses his arm because some random samurai just walked in front of him and got into a fight and just cut it off. That shows that in this world, you can accidentally bump into someone and you might not just piss them off, they might try to kill you in the process. This is actually the catalyst where we get to see that Jukai's apprentice actually learns about who he truly is and how he's trying to sort of atone for his past. But again, he's not having any of it, and he decides to leave. I have a feeling we're probably going to be seeing that character again. There's also another great moment where we get to see what's going on with Hyakkimaru's brother, Taho Maru, who's born just a year later after he was abandoned by his parents. And we get to see that basically he's the son that Daigo always wanted. He's an avid warrior, he's kind to everyone, he has a lot of promise for the future, and he's very much interested in the prospect of war. Something that I think probably makes his dad go from 6 to midnight, because considering he's insane, has an X-scar, and is sort of obsessed with making deals with demons. I'm waiting for that moment where eventually the two brothers are going to meet, and it's very obvious that there is going to be confrontation between the two. I wonder if it's going to be the main rivalry of the series, or if potentially these two characters could come together and maybe overthrow Daigo and his entire, regime. Overall, though, I think the overall theme of the episode was one of forgiveness and for atoning for the sins of your past. Also, there's just something kind of awesome about a man who is completely broken, who decides to actually help a young person who is also broken, and yet actually manages to rehabilitate them into one hell of an awesome person. Although, again, Hyakkimaru as a character is still kind of hard to read because he simply cannot communicate. I can't wait until he eventually begins to be able to talk. In a way, he's going to have to learn how to actually do that for the very first time. I don't think it's just going to come out naturally for him, especially because he still can't quite hear people, at least that we know of. You know, since he can't communicate, we don't really know how many of his senses he actually has back, but getting to see all of this actually happen is incredibly fascinating and has got me so excited for the rest of the series. This was another great episode, which is why I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5. I liked the episode. I even think that some of the choices they made, which were a little too annoying, like the flashback sequences, were all in black and white. It's a great way to save on color, but honestly, it works for flashback sequences, and Hyakkimaru Hyakkimaru's backstory I thought was thoroughly entertaining, didn't, like, pull the punches at all. This was also a very grisly kind of episode. The first, like, minute of this episode alone featured some very disturbing imagery of people being crucified, having fingers cut off, and even a very close-up shot of someone's ear just getting cut off very slowly. It shows that it's not going to pull any punches when it comes to the actual violence, and, you know, I think that's something that the series is sort of making a name for itself in some ways. From what I know, this is, again, sort of like a retelling of a classic Osamu Tezuka story. I don't know if it was this violent in the original manga, but man, if he were alive today, I would love to get his thoughts on it. But overall, I think this has been a really solid adaptation so far, and it's got me really excited for the future. And yet again, I missed the mark on getting my review out, so I'm going to do a quick, super quick review of the most recent episode of the series, which is a pretty interesting one, because in the world of Dororo, demons can take a number of different shapes and forms, and sometimes they can even possess certain objects. And in this episode, Hyakkimaru and Dororo are going to be doing battle with a cursed sword, a sword which has the ability to take over any human form, and whoever holds this sword will have a never-ending bloodlust and a quest to kill as many people as they possibly can. This was a pretty intense episode, and what I especially loved about it is that it sort of played with the fact that Hyakkimaru himself, while he is gaining back his senses and his humanity, still can't quite see or hear anything, and the only way that he's actually able to sort of, like, interact with this world is by seeing the fire of its soul. If it's red, he kills it, and if it's blue, it's fine. And whoever is holding this red object is immediately going to be the object of his wrath. And that's what made this episode so interesting. They actually go as far to introduce this new character who looks kind of like a weird, freaky Japanese version of Jay Leno, and he's the one who's in possession of this evil sword, and it has such a grip on him that it's completely twisted his mind and even changed the color of his hair. And he's basically just sort of roaming the Japanese countryside and killing anyone that he comes across, or whenever the actual sword itself demands some sort of sacrifice. The story itself is also very tragic, as his only family member left, his sister, is desperately trying to bring him back to his humanity, but no, he is so in touch with this sword that really it has dominated his entire existence. What makes the episode so interesting is when Dororo himself actually finds the blade and unfortunately picks it up. When he does this, he can't put it down, and this is when he starts to become hunted by Hyakkimaru. And at first the stakes were really high, and I thought, whoa, Hyakkimaru can't really understand that this is actually Dororo who's holding this blade, and he's just sort of attacking him discriminately. But no, he's actually so smart that he actually knows to actually knock the blade out of his hand, and even goes as far as to actually destroy it by the end of the episode, after having an incredibly tense fight with this swordsman who he runs into a couple of times. By the end of the episode, it looks like he's gaining some brand new senses back, which very well might be his hearing. So, what's the rundown on this episode of Dororo? Another fantastic episode that's one of the more slower, methodic episodes of the entire series, but honestly, I really did enjoy it. I especially loved the big samurai battle at the beginning of the episode, which was very cleanly animated. But what I especially loved about this episode was at the end with the prospect of him gaining back a brand new sense, and apparently it looks like he's going to be able to finally hear again. He's grasping at his ears and struggling with the fact that, yes, he can finally hear things, which means his communication skills are only going to get better with everyone that he actually interacts with. The whole story of the sister trying to save the brother is pretty intense, especially with the whole flashback sequence of watching him get the sword for the first time. He was actually working under this lord who commanded him to execute a soldier, and when he gets this sword for the first time, not only does he kill that guy, but he pretty much just ends up killing everyone around him in a massive massacre scene, being taken over by this evil blade. It's a pretty awesome scene and goes in line with the rest of the series. I wish I had more time to talk about this, but to be perfectly honest, guys, I'm just really running low on time, but I wanted to give my quick thoughts on this episode, and yes, it was another great episode of Dororo, high on the atmosphere, with some pretty beautiful action and a nice twist ending. I really dug it. That's why I'm going to give this episode a 4 out of 5. So thank you all for watching that review and the previous reviews. Make sure to give me all your thoughts about all these episodes of Dororo in the comment section below, and what you hope to see from the future of this brand new anime series. Thank you all for watching this review. I'll see you all next time, and as always, stay down there, baby.